Today we're gonna take a look at Acts chapter 27, and this is a very exciting chapter, so I really hope you stick around until the end. It's an exciting story. If you read it, it's like you're in a teen novel or maybe a movie with suspension. Yet this is not a fantasy story. This is true history, and also there is a strong message in there. For the sake of time, I will not read all the verses, but I suggest that after hearing today's message, you read it for yourself, and I think you will experience it different than before. It's a story about being on sea, about sailing. So certainly if you're interested in the sea and in boats and things like that, it is interesting. And if you like that kind of stories, I would also recommend a free downloadable ebook from our website called The Sea is Unpredictable, which is also a short story parable that has to do with the sea and with sailing. Okay, situation is that Paul is in custody in Caesarea. He's not yet convicted. He has appealed to Caesar, and so his case will be brought before Caesar. He's waiting for that for quite a few years already, and now we come to the point that he is actually going to make the journey to Rome. We read the first 3 verses of Acts 27. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia. One Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And the next day we touched at Sidon. And Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. Now it was common that criminals who were awaiting trial were transported on merchant ships to Rome, accompanied by Roman soldiers. And the special favor that Paul enjoyed from this Julius allowed him to take friends with him. If you note, it says here, we should sail into Italy, and then later on being with us. So this means that the writer Luke was also there with Paul, as well as this Aristarchus and maybe some others. Now, he could even meet with friends in the cities where they went into the harbor. He could get on shore and meet with friends he had there, as it says, to refresh himself. So he was quite privileged. The other prisoners didn't have this privilege because they were already condemned. And they were most likely to be transported to Rome to die in the arena. So the next verses continue to describe how they sail under Cyprus, it says. And I'll show it to you on a map. They land in Myra, in Lycia, and that's where they transfer to an Alexandrian ship heading for Italy. Now Alexandria is on the coast of Egypt, and that is where the grain came from. That was then transported with grain freighters to Italy. So that's what is the case here. So these ships, these grain freighters, were about 140 by 36 feet, or 47 by 12 meters, as I have depicted here. they usually had one or two square or rectangular sails. They had no rudder, but two paddles to steer. And they were very strong boats, but they couldn't sail against the wind. They only could sail with the wind in the back. So they were a bit hard to navigate. And so that's why it says that the wind forced them to pass Crete southward. And then they get set all the way to Crete, and then they make a stop in a harbor called Fair Havens. That's where they end up eventually. And so we read in verse 9. Now when much time was spent and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. So Paul is now warning the shipsmen and the guards that they better not continue because of the dangers ahead. Now it speaks about the fast. The fast was already spent or past. Now the fast refers to the Day of Atonement, and in that year, which was 59 AD, that was on October 5th. So winter was approaching. Basically from mid-September to mid-November the waters were rough and it was dangerous, and after that they would not sail in open sea until after the winter. So it was already in a period of time that it was risky. And so Paul warns for disaster. Now you can say, how did he know? Well, first of all, he had quite some experience. He had already traveled thousands of miles on the Mediterranean, this area, the Adriatic, and he had already shipwrecked 3 times, as he writes in 2 Corinthians. So he had some experience, and besides, it's very possible that God told him, as we will read later, that God revealed to him what was going to happen. However, the men on the boat decide not to adhere to Paul's advice. And also the bay that they were in, that was called Fair Havens, was actually not so fair. It was very vulnerable to rough water. It was not a protected bay. And the town was a small town, and the crew was not very happy if they had to stay there the whole winter in this small, boring town. And so they decided to sail to Phoenicia, on the west side of Crete, which was not so far, about 40 miles, 60 kilometers westward. And so it sounded reasonable to just go along the coast of Crete to that city and then stay there for the winter. And so it says in verse 13, and when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, losing thence, they sailed close by Crete. So it looked good, it was a good start, everything went fine so far. But then if we continue to read, we see that a storm arises, and the storm is called Evroklidon, which it's a word that is made out of 2 words. Evros means east wind, and Klidon most likely comes from the Latin word aquilo, which means north wind. So we would call it a northeaster. And some Bibles translate it that way. It was a strong wind and it was a feared wind. It was dangerous, a dangerous storm. And all they could do with this ship is to let it go with the wind. And as the water get more rough, they have to take measures. They normally were towing behind them a small boat, a skiff, that they would use when they would anchor somewhere. They would use this skiff to get to the shore. They had to take it on board now. It was too dangerous to have it hanging behind them. And it took much effort to get this skiff on board. But they did so, and they were driven south, it says, south of the island Clauda. Clauda is a small satellite island south of Crete. So that's where they were. And finally they had to take more drastic measures. They had to undergird the ship, it says. This means they had to take ropes and get them under the ship and around the hull to keep it together. These were wooden ships and they could break apart. And so with these ropes, with this undergirding, they were strengthening the hull. They also had to lower sail, and finally they had to also throw the ship's equipment overboard to make it lighter. Now the ship's equipment went first, not the cargo, because the cargo was valuable, and so they hoped, of course, to save at least part of the cargo. And so in spite of all these measures, the ship was driven for many days, and days in a row they could not see the sun or the stars, it says. And that was really a problem, because they needed the sun and the stars to understand where they were, and so now they had no clue where they were going. And they had lost all hope that they would survive. And then there was seasickness, there was poor conditions of the food in those days, and all this prevented them from eating. They were not eating, and the situation was very grim. And then at some point Paul speaks again to the men in verse 21. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. Now this is a typical situation of, I have good news and I have bad news. And he begins with the bad news, and the bad news is, I told you so, you should have listened. Now he doesn't say I told you so in a sarcastic way, but he makes clear that what he had said indeed came to pass. He was acting as a messenger of God, as a prophet, if you will. And after the example of Jesus, and we saw this a few chapters before, exactly the same, after the example of Jesus, he says, be of good cheer. It's one word in Greek, tharsi. And just like Jesus, he says it in the midst of the storm. How could anyone be of good cheer in this situation? There was no reason to be in good cheer. They were hungry, they were miserable, they were in fear of death. There was no hope. And he says, be of good cheer. And why? And how? Well, first of all, it requires faith. It requires faith in God's promises. And so the question is, what is the promise here? And so that's what he adds. The promise is that no one, not a single one, would die, but the ship would be lost. Now, that was actually quite unimaginable, that the ship would be lost, destroyed, but that all would survive. That truly required a lot of faith. And Paul continues to say, for there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve. So he's saying, I'm not making this up. It's not wishful thinking. God had actually sent an angelic messenger to bring the good news. And Paul uses this opportunity to testify that he serves God. This is his God. He belongs to God. And that's also the reason why God sent his angel to him. Those who serve God, that's what we see here, those who serve God are not always spared from the calamity, because he was in the midst of the same storm and misery. And the difference, however, is that God is present, even in those situations. And we saw it exactly the same when Paul was in prison and Jesus visited him and said the same, be of good cheer. And he was still in prison, but Jesus was there. Now, the first thing that the angel says in verse 24, fear not, Paul. Thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. The first thing the angel says is, fear not. And actually, if you scrutinize the scripture and you see where angels of God appear, that is practically always the first thing that the angel says, fear not. There are reasons, of course, to say this. If an angel appears, one might be quite shocked of this appearance. That's one thing, but the other thing is that Paul probably was fearing, like the rest of the crew. Maybe not in the same way, in the same extent, but he probably had fear as well. Of course, Jesus had promised him personally that he would go to Rome. He knew that, but it had been a while ago that Jesus appeared to him, and now, in the midst of the storm, Paul needed assurance. And as believers, we have the same thing. Sometimes we forget or we doubt God's promises. Maybe we read them in scripture and we believe them, but then when things get rough, we tend to forget it. We need assurance. And God is faithful and graceful and often answers that as well, if we truly seek Him. Paul already had a promise for his own safety. If the angel had said, you will go to Rome, you will be brought before Caesar, period, he could have said, okay, I'm happy, I will survive this no matter what. But that's not Paul. Paul cared for all the souls on board, and there were 275 others besides him, quite a few. And so he prays for them too. And the answer that the angel gives is, God hath given thee all that sail with thee. So all these souls will be saved. All of them. And so Paul continues to speak to the rest of the men on board, and he says, wherefore, sirs, in verse 25, be of good cheer, for I believe God, and it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. He repeats what he said before, be of good cheer. But now they knew why. Because God had made a promise. But it would require much faith. Why? Because it's a mixed message. You will be saved, but the ship will be lost. We will shipwreck on a certain island. To shipwreck was not a nice perspective, and normally that would mean loss of lives. But in this case it wouldn't. It required faith. Now God had not revealed on which island or how this would be possible. It simply required faith. Paul testifies of his faith. He doesn't just say it and then say, well, do with it what you want. He says, I believe that it will be as it was told me. I believe God that it will be as it was told me. Notice what he says. I believe God. He did not say, I believe in God. We know Satan and all his demons, they believe in God. We read that in James, 2nd chapter. They believe in God, they tremble, but obviously they're not saved. Most people actually believe in the existence of God or of a God of sorts. But very few believe God. There's a big difference believing in God or in a God or believing God. Very few trust His word. Very few trust His promises. But that is what faith is. To believe God. Not just to believe in God. And if you think it through, what else was there to believe? And it's really illustrated by the situation here. Paul couldn't believe the sailors. They were powerless. They were as helpless and full of fear as all the others. He couldn't believe the ship. The ship was held together by ropes, ready to fall apart. He couldn't believe the sail. The sail was taken down. He couldn't believe the wind, which was relentless and going on for days and days in a row. He couldn't believe the Roman guards. They too were as powerless and helpless as all the others. He couldn't believe anything but God. And that is the same situation that we are in. We cannot believe or trust anything or anyone in this world around us. We see it being confirmed day after day. Unfortunately, but that is the reality. There are wars, there are famines, there are pestilences, there are all kinds of threats, even in our Western world, where we think that we are, or maybe we thought that we were away from all these things. Now we see that food and energy shortages are upon us, that prices are skyrocketing, life becomes more difficult, and there is less and less prospect before us. That's the ship that we are on, that's the storm that we are in. Who can we believe? What can we believe? Well, God has the same promises. They are all here for those who believe Him. And the promise is, you will be saved. You will be saved. But the ship will be lost and everything on it. The ship being the world. That's where we are. And so it is imperative that we believe God. We believe God. We must. So, having said this, the situation continues. It's not resolved right away. This is what we often see. Jesus says, be of good cheer. And then we're still in the same situation. And so, same here. It says then in verse 27, but when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. So 2 weeks they were already in this storm, seeing no sun, no stars. They must have been desperate. Sometimes our faith is tested to the limit. How can you believe God in such a situation? And indeed many give up. But then the sailors sensed they were near land. It doesn't say how they sensed. Obviously they didn't have a radar. But what is likely is that they could hear from the waves, the sound of the waves, that there had to be land nearby. And so they were measuring the depth and finding that it got shallower and shallower. And so they decided to throw out anchors so that they would not crash into the coast. And then it says they prayed for the day. In this translation it says they waited for or wished for the day, but actually it says they prayed for the day. This is typical. Often we see that unbelievers call out to God when they face the fear of death, or when they are shocked. How many times do you not hear people say, "Oh my God"? This OMG is like an abbreviation and an exclamation that is thrown around all the time. Who is this, my God? That's another story. But you see that when people are shocked or full of fear, they call out to God. It's like something that's naturally in us. But waiting until you face death before you call out to God is not a very good tactic, because it might just be too late. And also many people have prayed to God when they were in sickness, in despair, in great need. Maybe you have experienced this yourself when you were desperate, that you pray to God, please help me. But then when the situation is over, then it's often just as quickly forgotten and life goes on as before. Why expect God to honor you if you do not honor Him? Now God would make it more difficult for these men here. He would raise the bar for testing their faith and make them even more dependent on him. And we read in verse 30, "And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color, as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, 'Except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off." So what is happening? The crew wants to flee. They know there's land nearby. They deem it hopeless to save this whole ship. In other words, they don't believe what Paul believes and told them. And so they go into this skiff, they let it down and go into this small boat, pretending that they have to do something with the anchors there at the stern of the ship. But in reality they had planned to take this small boat to the coast and flee and save their own lives and let the others figure it out themselves. And so, but they are exposed in the act, and Paul says to the soldiers, to the Romans, if they do not stay on board, no one will be saved. And so the men are brought back on board, the crew, and then the Roman soldiers, who apparently trust Paul by now, they make the decision to cut off this small boat, this skiff, and let it go. And this would take away any chance for them to get safely on shore when they would be near land. Really, only God could now do something. So this made the situation even more dire. There was no way to leave the ship but by the hand of God. And so they were in need of some encouragement, and Paul provided it, verse 33. "And while the day was coming on," which means early in the morning still, "Paul besought them all to make meat, to take meat meaning food, saying, 'This is the day, the 14th day that you have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat. For this is for your health, for there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you.' And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. And then were they all of good cheer. And they also took some meat, some food. And we were all in the ship 316 souls, that's 276. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. So after 2 weeks of not eating, Paul encourages them to eat, to get some strength for their own health. And he repeats this promise, "Not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." It's a powerful promise for those who believe it. And through the Bible, God has given us many powerful promises for those who believe it. As they were encouraged, they throw the last cargo of wheat into the sea to lighten the ship so that they could get drawn nearer to the coast without running on the rocks. So basically, the equipment and the cargo is already lost. Now, how is all this going to play out? Verse 39. "And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail into the wind, and made toward shore. And falling into a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves." The land that they saw was, just as foretold by the angel, an island. As we can find out in the next chapter, it was the island of Melita, that we know nowadays as Malta. Now, if you see on the map, Malta is just a blip in the Mediterranean Sea. And so the chances that after being tossed around there for 2 full weeks, that they would end up there, these chances are very slim. And if they had missed it, they would have continued and gone past the north coast of Africa, and certainly would have been lost. But God had directed it this way. Now the bay where they ran ashore is called to this very day St. Paul's Bay, because of this shipwreck. So they run the ship against the coast, and as the front part is stuck in the bottom, the back part is broken by the still violent waves. So basically the ship is eaten away from behind as it's stuck there. And so it's of course now important that they get all off. But then the soldiers have another thought. Verse 42. The soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all save to land. Now, according to the Roman law, a Roman guard who would allow a prisoner to escape would get the same punishment that the prisoner would have had. And in this case, this was death. And so the soldiers thought, in order to save their own lives or secure their own lives, that they better kill the prisoners so that they could not escape. But fortunately, the centurion that was guarding Paul, that was Julius, he didn't want to lose Paul, and so he convinced his colleagues not to do this. And so all of them swim to shore, either on their own power or with the help of pieces of wood from the ship. And as all 276 get off the ship is totally broken and eaten away by the sea. In this age of grace that we live in, many are blessed because of the grace that God sheds on His people. It's just as all these people on the ship, they were all blessed because of the grace that God had for Paul. God could have also saved only Paul, and still His purpose would have been fulfilled, but it was not so. So that's what we see in the world around us. And most people are not aware of this. They just live their lives and they think everything's fine. They don't realize that actually they are spared because of the grace that God sheds on His people. As it is written, the rain falls on the just and on the unjust. And we saw it also in Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abram was pleading with God, if there are only 10 righteous people, will you spare the city? And God said, yes, I would. Of course, there were not even 10, but the whole city, this wicked city, would have been spared because of 10 righteous people. So that's what we see here on the ship, that's what we see in the world around us. But this age of grace is coming to an end. The ship that we are on, called the world, will shipwreck. And nothing will be left of it. Just as in this story. But this time, not all will be saved. Not all will be saved. But like in Sodom, like with Noah's flood, God will remove his people first. He will remove the restrainer first, as Paul calls it. He will remove them first, and then disaster will come. The destruction will come, and the ship and anything on it will be lost. And that too was foretold by God. And we have it here. We've spoken about it many times here on this channel. And we have to be like Paul. We have to be able to say, I believe my God and I serve him. Not just believe in God and think everything will be fine. We have to believe God for his word and serve him and trust him. And we will be saved. Amen.